One of the greatest emigration stories of the entire 20th century is that of the Refuseniks, the Jewish men and women caught behind the Soviet Union's Iron Curtain who fought their oppressors and eventually made their way to Israeli soil. There are a lot of well-known male Refuseniks, but there are just as many female Refuseniks who were equally as important, if not as famous. Avital Sharansky, Reiza Palatnik, Nudel, and Sylvia Zalmanson are just a few of these heroic women without whom Soviet Jewry's fate would look extremely different. In today's episode, we'll take a deep dive into the fascinating stories of these women of the Refusenik movement. We'll focus on the heroes and forgotten figures of this fascinating part of Jewish history. For more information about the Soviet relationship with Israel, check out our episode on the 20th century Soviet Jewry. The Six-Day War kickstarted a new era in Soviet Jewish consciousness. The USSR government had supported many of the Arab countries warring with Israel and had even outfitted some with Soviet arms, which felt like a betrayal to the many Soviet Jews hoping to move to Israel. These people dreamed of moving to Israel, but converting that dream into a reality was nearly impossible since Soviet Russia was not a free state. You needed approval from the government to emigrate, and pretty much every Jew who applied to leave was rejected without explanation, though some would-be emigrators were fed bogus reasons that they couldn't leave because they might spread state secrets. As you might imagine, life was extremely difficult for these rejects, or refuseniks as they came to be known. A rejected applicant was placed in a state of refusal, a period that could last months or years, and occasionally even decades. The two biggest male names that came to symbolize the Refusenik movement and put a face on it were the activists Yosef Mendelovich and Natan Sharansky. Together, the two men would come to symbolize the unbroken spirit of the Refuseniks. Both of these Refuseniks were critical in freeing the Soviet Jews, but there were many specific women who were equally as crucial. Let's unpack their stories. In 1971, a few women in England heard the news that 35-year-old Reiza Palatnik of Odessa had been apprehended by the KGB. They decided to hold a night vigil protest outside the Soviet consulate. This single act inspired thousands of women in the United States, the United Kingdom, and all across the world to get more involved in these movements to bring down the Iron Curtain. The Women's Campaign for Soviet Jewry, commonly known as the 35s in honor of Palatnik, came into being in May 1971. The 35s set up meetings between the Refuseniks and Jewish visitors to the Soviet Union, some of whom smuggled in forbidden items like food and religious artifacts. They also sponsored concerts on behalf of Soviet Jewry by performers that included Karl Bach and the folk singer Theodor Bickel. Although the KGB liked to dismiss the Refuseniks movement as students and housewives, the 35s helped begin to show the world that sometimes you should fear housewives. Ultimately, these courageous women's efforts helped unify Jewish people around the world and free many of those imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain. But it wasn't just groups of selfless, semi-anonymous women who came together to help Soviet Jews. Natan Sharansky's wife, Avital, was one of the most tireless campaigners for her husband's freedom and the freedom of thousands of others just like him. Avital had an interesting background. She learned that she was Jewish when she was 14 years old, and this revelation captured her heart, inspiring a lifelong love of Jews, Judaism, and the state of Israel. She and her future husband Anatoly, as he was then known, attended Hebrew class together, which was a risky move in and of itself since Soviets were working to stamp out all religions. Avital was impressed by Anatoly's proficiency with Hebrew and his kind offers to help her learn the language. She and Natan, as he came to be known, married shortly before he was imprisoned. She left for Israel the day after their wedding in 1974, and Natan, who had been denied an exit visa, expected to join her shortly after. Except he didn't. He was thrown in jail on trumped-up treason charges, which catalyzed Avital to do everything in her power to free her new husband, who she had only lived with for one day. In the years that followed, Avital met with activists and political leaders across the US and around the world. She sat down with kings, queens, presidents, prime ministers, and Jewish leaders, including presidents and senators. She led marches and spoke at rallies, making sure to be present whenever a group gathered in protest of the Soviet government. And her activism paid off. In addition to mass lobbying and rallying by concerned citizens, these efforts led to the signing of a statement of conscience by 2,400 American scientists, including 13 Nobel laureates, who pledged to avoid cooperating with the Soviet Union until Sharansky was freed, which he was. After 250,000 people rallied in Washington, D.C. that year, President Reagan turned up the pressure on Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev agreed to release Sharansky in exchange for a number of Russian detainees. The Jewish world and the Free Soviet Jewry movement viewed this as a watershed moment in their activities, and for good reason. In February of 1986, Natan Sharansky, the face of the Refuseniks, was once more a free man. After helping secure her husband's release, Avital retreated from public view. She raised 2 children with Natan, who continued his political work and used his now expanded platform to bring attention to similar struggles across the globe. Another important female Refusenik was Ida Nudel. Nudel was born in southern Russia and studied economics in Moscow. In the early 1970s, she tried to emigrate to Israel with her family, but was denied an exit visa under the false charge that she had been privy to state secrets. She stayed in the Soviet Union and became active in aiding Jewish emigration. Some people even called her the guardian angel for how she cared for the Jewish prisoners and their families. She arranged demonstrations, correspondences, and meetings with foreigners visiting Moscow, and her work brought public attention to the Refusenik struggles. In 1978, Nudel was sentenced to 4 years exile in Siberia for hanging a banner on the balcony of her apartment that read, "KGB, give me my exit visa." Her time in Siberia was as awful as you'd expect, with her tossed in a freezing, overcrowded, foul-smelling barrack in a camp zone surrounded by barbed wire fences and armed guards and watchtowers. She became perhaps the most famous Refusenik in the Western world and won the sympathy and support of Hollywood actresses including Jane Fonda and Liv Ullmann. Ullmann even played Nudel in a film based on her life and experiences. In 1987, Nudel was finally permitted to leave the USSR, and she chose to settle in Israel. Sylvia Zalmanson is the third and final Refusenik woman we'll be talking about today. She was born in Siberia in 1944 and fled the Nazis with her family, ultimately settling in Latvia. She studied to be an engineer and long dreamed of living in Israel. However, when she and her husband tried to obtain visas to leave the Soviet Union, they were met with a firm no. But instead of sitting around and waiting, they came up with a daring escape plan. They called their plan Operation Wedding. It was a simple hijacking attempt. The group of Refuseniks, which also included Yosef Mendelovich, would buy tickets for a local flight, pretending to fly to a wedding, and while on board, they would hijack the plane and pilot it safely over Soviet borders. But before they could carry out their plan, the KGB caught wind of it and arrested Zalmanson, her husband, and the others who'd been involved. They were all charged with high treason. In her trial, Zalmanson spoke bravely on the stand, critiquing the Soviets' unlawful practice of refusing Jewish emigration and quoting 2 of the most beloved biblical verses about Israel. Next year in Jerusalem, and if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Zalmanson was sentenced to prison in a Soviet labor camp, but was released after 4 years in a Soviet-Israeli prisoner swap. She immediately emigrated to Israel, where she was joined soon after by her husband, who himself was released 5 years later. Today, Zalmanson is a working artist who displays her work in Israel and abroad. Well, there you have it. The outcome of Soviet Jewry might have looked very different if not for these heroic women. It might sound almost cliche, but when these women united in support of a common cause, they changed the course of history. Through their passion for getting the Refuseniks fair treatment, they slowly chipped away at the Iron Curtain until it all but cracked wide open. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week.